Well, hello everyone. As we begin our brief look into Romanticism, the ideal place to start is to talk about a book of poetry that is very important in terms of English literature and is important even to the 21st century. It's widely regarded as the start of what we can call modern poetry. And by modern poetry, it's referring to that type of writing that breaks free from the confines that had limited poetry literally for hundreds and hundreds of years. Before Romanticism, the subject, the topic of poetry was largely limited to stories about legends and mythology, right? If you might be common with poems like that. And as well, it was written for a very elite audience. In other words, when you think about the social pyramid, for hundreds and hundreds of years, poetry was written for the high class society. But now, when we enter into Romanticism and the start of modern poetry, all of that changes. And it happened very quietly in the year 1798 with the publication of Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads is the title of a volume of poetry that was published initially anonymously by William Wordsworth and his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who are two of the authors that we'll be looking at in our brief study of Romanticism. And a lot of people say, well, why was it published anonymously? Because, why would they not put their name to it? And reason being, what they were looking at doing in Lyrical Ballads was really revolutionary. They were being rebels, and if it didn't work out, they didn't want to have their names attached to this to prevent them from getting jobs such as, a teaching posting or maybe being a postmaster, anything like that. This was really a gamble. So people say, well, gosh, what was going on inside of Lyrical Ballads that was such a gamble? Well, let me take a brief look into a passage from the preface to Lyrical Ballads that was written by William Wordsworth. And this is the paragraph that begins the principal object. So this is the start of that paragraph. The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men. And this is something that is really revolutionary that today in the 21st century we just gloss over and we're unaware of. What happened, right? Look at the year, 1798. Wordsworth and Coleridge, on purpose, started a revolution in writing. Remember, the R in Romanticism stands for revolution. What was that revolution? They're writing poems, right? Situations and incidents from common life. This is writing that's meant for people like us, commoners. This is poetry that's not meant for the elite. It's not meant for the royals. It's for everyday folks. And it's to be written in language really used by men. In other words, we don't have to go pull a dictionary from the shelf and look up words anymore because Wordsworth and Coleridge, on purpose, are using diction that was heard every day by commoners. Now, and then, at the same time, to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. So if you remember from the period overview, we talked about the importance of the imagination, right? So that's going to be woven in here. So we're going to take things common and ordinary language that people would hear every day, and then weave in the imagination to make things that were ordinary extraordinary. In other words, there's a wonderful thing about poetry, especially during this time, that these poems are written about things that many people would overlook. So what the poets are going to do is they're going to capture these moments and render them into something that is extraordinary. Now, a little bit further into this same paragraph, humble and rustic life was generally chosen, because in that condition, the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language. Now, this connects to the period overview when it talked about primitivism. If you remember that, flip back in your notes from the PowerPoint. This is the belief that when people lived away from the city, they were more moral, that their upbringing was more conducive. They were just better people because they were away from society. So inside of Lyrical Ballads, right, again, 1798, that there's lots of poems out in the country, very common, ordinary settings. And it's because of all of this that many people look to the year 1798 as the start of English Romanticism. That'd be a good question to sneak into a test or an exam, by the way. Now, something very important is further into the preface to Lyrical Ballads, what William Wordsworth does is he talks about poetry and he defines poetry. And a famous quote from Wordsworth is, "Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings." Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And that is another tie-in to the period overview in the PowerPoint. Spontaneity, vigor, boldness. All of these things we will start to see throughout the period literature. And other poets that we'll take a look at in Romanticism, they were really, really affected by this very small volume of poetry that was written in 1798, Lyrical Ballads, arguably the start of English Romanticism. And just in case you're curious, further editions, Wordsworth and Coleridge did put their names on it because it quickly became very, very influential. In addition, it was a big seller. And Wordsworth and Coleridge were able to stake their reputation as well as their livelihood based upon this publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798.